Hey, it's Annalicia. What you're about to tune into is an episode from my Exercise 180 podcast. My E180 podcast is a private podcast for my E180 members only. The first 18 episodes consist of the audio-only version of my E180 course lessons, plus my Fit and Fabulous for Life masterclass. Episode 19 marks the beginning of extended E180 content and includes audio notes from me, so top-of-mind insights from my personal life and responses to questions from my E180 members, plus interviews with other thought leaders. If you'd like to learn more about becoming an E180 member and getting access to this private podcast, go to the description box of this video. You'll find a special link there that will allow you to become a member at a major discount. Now, on to the topic at hand. Hey, it's Annalicia. Welcome to part 2 of our 4-part emotional health and healing series. Today, I'm really excited to reflect on an incredible book called No Bad Parts. This book was written by Dr. Richard Schwartz, PhD. Richard is a therapist whose work is characterized by a non-pathologizing therapeutic technique that is based on compassion, trust, honesty, and encouragement. I love that so much. So Richard's work invites people to acknowledge each unique part of themselves and invites them to recognize the strengths and weaknesses within these parts and how they may influence behaviors and emotions. So what you're going to find is that Richard will transform the way you understand your psyche. And I know that's a big statement, but it truly has been the case for me. He will transform the way you understand your psyche. So his work will help you realize that each of us is not a single entity, but instead a quote-unquote family of distinct inner parts. In other words, he challenges the monomind theory and instead promotes the idea that our minds are multifaceted. And he calls his multifaceted model internal family systems. So Richard believes that the parts within our internal systems carry our psychological burdens, but they are healed when we learn to give them space and listen to them by accessing our wise and loving inner core, which he calls quote-unquote self with a capital S. Now, before we move any further into this discussion on Richard's incredible work, I want to mention that if you haven't listened to the previous episodes in this series, consider pausing this now and tuning into those first, because this series really is intended to build on itself. So if you go to episode 57, you'll find this series intro episode, which is kind of like a bonus episode, but definitely worth tuning into because it sets the stage for the entire series. In that intro episode, I talk about the difference between building your capacity to meet the difficulties of life compared to endlessly waffling between bypassing and blending. Then in episode 58, which is kind of like the official start of the series, you could say, so part 1 of the 4-part series, we look at the idea of bypassing through the lens of Dr. Gabor Mate's work. And Gabor is a medical doctor who wrote the brilliant book, When the Body Says No. Now, here, in this episode, so part 2 of this 4-part series, we're going to shift our focus from the concept of bypassing to the concept of blending. I was first introduced to this concept of blending through Richard Schwartz's work. As I mentioned before, Richard teaches that our psyche is not one single uniformed thing, but consists of many different parts of ourselves. And until we begin to understand this idea and get to know our different parts, it can be very easy to unconsciously blend with our parts and think that that's just quote unquote who we are as an individual. So for example, there may be a part of you who is anxious a lot, or a part of you would characterize as lazy or addictive. And if you are unconsciously blending with these parts, you might say, that's just who I am, I'm anxious. Or that's just who I am, I can never seem to get it together, I'm lazy. Or that's just who I am, I can't seem to break the bad habit. But once you begin to understand Richard's theory, you'll grow in your capacity to unblend from these parts, and you'll be more apt to say things like, there's a part of me that feels anxious about that. Or there's a part of me that feels really unmotivated to make this change, even though other parts of me are really excited about it. Or there's a part of me that can't stop thinking about the thing I swore I would give up. So let's just stop and take a breath, because this is pretty powerful, isn't it? This idea first that maybe our psyche isn't this one uniform thing, right? But multifaceted. And then on top of that, the idea that we can practice unblending, which is really creating space for different parts of us to be seen and heard. Now, what's been really wild for me about Richard's work is how closely it parallels with many of our E180 concepts. So Richard teaches that our parts will fall under one of three categories. So they'll either be a manager, a firefighter, or an exile. Managers and firefighters are protectors. And what are they protecting? They are protecting our system, so our psyche, from being taken over or overwhelmed by the feelings of our exiles. What are our exiles? Put simply, our exiles are the parts of us that have been hurt. So, for example, maybe you dealt with a bully on the playground in first grade, and you didn't really know how to process that experience at the time. So there's likely a part of you that took that experience and internalized that something is wrong with you. Those are our exiled parts, the parts who have internalized that something's wrong with who we are. Now let's think about our 4 quadrants of life for a moment. So if you need a refresher on the 4 quadrants, head to Module 2, Lesson 1. That's episode 5 here on the podcast. But if you remember, our 4 quadrants are an intersection of perspective and action. So on the y-axis, the vertical axis, we have perspective, with the top being freedom and the bottom being bondage. And on the x-axis, we have action, with the right being engaged and the left being disengaged. And if you remember, the bottom left-hand quadrant is characterized by the feelings of what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me. So in other words, when we're in the bottom left-hand quadrant, we're likely blending with one of our exiles. Now, it gets even more wild, you guys, in terms of how this all parallels with our E180 concepts, because the protectors, so remember that's your manager parts and your firefighter parts, the protectors, their characteristics align with the other 2 quadrants in our vicious 180 triangle. So if you remember, the vicious 180, or what I call the V180 for short, is a triangle that lands on our 4 quadrants, and it starts in the bottom left-hand quadrant. It goes to the bottom right-hand quadrant, then it pops up to the top left-hand quadrant, and down again to the bottom left-hand quadrant. And this V180 is a vicious cycle that tricks you into thinking things are getting better, but ultimately leaves you feeling defeated. So the reason I gave it the vicious 180 name is because if you add up all the angles of a triangle, you'll get 180 degrees. However, the V180 is not a positive 180 shift, one where you truly make a change for the better and you're able to sustain it. And so what I found in Richard's work is that the managers embody the essence of the bottom right-hand quadrant, and our firefighters embody the essence of the top left-hand quadrant. So we've got exile essence in the bottom left-hand quadrant, we've got manager essence in the bottom right-hand quadrant, and we've got firefighter essence in the top left-hand quadrant. So Richard talks about how managers try to proactively protect you from the feelings of your exiles, and firefighters will take over more reactively when your manager's efforts fail. So let's just think about this in terms of our V180 and how it plays out. So, we've got the bottom left-hand quadrant, which once again is characterized by this feeling of what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me. And like we talk about in our course and our Fit and Fabulous for Life masterclass, that's the most uncomfortable of human experiences. The what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me, which is very similar to what Richard's work is saying as well, right? He's saying that we have parts of us that are trying to do everything that they can to not feel that feeling. Once again, the protector parts within us are trying to protect us from the exile's feelings of what's wrong with me. Okay, so we've got the exile's essence in the bottom left-hand quadrant. And like we talk about in our course, what do we often do to try to get away from that feeling? We muster up willpower and we try to take some action so that we don't feel so bad about ourselves. right? And so that brings us from the bottom left-hand quadrant to the bottom right-hand quadrant. So that's where we get exhausted, we burn out, and we are embodying the energy of the manager. So in Richard's work, the manager is always trying to kind of like outsmart the negative feelings. You know what I mean? And I don't know why I'm laughing, except for it's just funny that we think we can outthink feelings, right? Because the way we truly heal is by being willing to feel our feelings and recognizing that we can build our capacity to do that, right? But when we're blended with the managers, we're not in that space. We're trying to outsmart our feelings. And so we jump into action to do this, that, and the other thing to try to not feel like we're the worst person in the world, right? And then like we talk about in the course, nobody can sustain that energy. It's by definition unsustainable. And so eventually, in some aspect of your life, you're going to pop up to the top left, right? And that's where the firefighter lives. So the firefighter is the one who is going to reactively try to save you from your negative feelings. So you might binge on food, you might binge on alcohol, things of that nature to try to do, you know, whatever you can to not feel these negative feelings of what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me. The irony of the firefighter, of course, the irony of the top left-hand quadrant is that we can't stay there very long before we feel guilty about those behaviors, right? And so the irony is that it oftentimes the top left-hand quadrant activities and actions and behaviors, or you could say our firefighter behaviors actually cause us then to drop into the bottom left-hand quadrant to feel some of those exiled feelings, the what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with me, which again, like we talk about in the course, then just initiates, if we're unconsciously blending, it then just initiates another V180, right? And, you know, I think that term unconscious and blending is the key here, right? Because we start to have choices when we're able to unblend and start to see these things, start to understand where we're at. And just like we talk about in the course, the E180 philosophy is not about never being in these other quadrants, right? The E180 philosophy is about being able to recognize where you're at more. So another way to put that is the E180 philosophy really, without knowing the term unblending, is really promoting that practice, right? Of being able to unblend and see the bigger picture of what might be happening so we can disrupt these unconscious vicious cycles. Now, on top of that, what I really love about Richard's work is he's recognizing that not only are we multifaceted, so in other words, put in E180 terms, not only do we have the four quadrants of life experiences, right? But on top of that, there's systems at play. You know what I mean? So in other words, with the vicious 180, there's three different components to that play off of one another. And one major aspect of disrupting our vicious patterns is realizing that they're not acting alone, right? So in other words, your feelings in the bottom left-hand quadrant affect then why you start to take action and move into the bottom right-hand quadrant. And the lack of sustainability and exhaustion that builds up when you're in the bottom right-hand quadrant then lead to the top left-hand quadrant respite that you try to get, and then those behaviors. And then those behaviors have you drop into the bottom left-hand quadrant. So put into Richard Schwartz's language is your exiles then affect your managers affect your firefighters affect your exiles. And it becomes, like he says, this internal system. And I think it's powerful to think in that way. I think the more we can begin to not only see ourselves as multifaceted, but also see ourselves in terms of systems, and then systems within ourselves, but then also in terms of being a part of systems outside of ourselves. Family systems, cultural systems, food systems, we begin to understand ourselves from a more holistic place. And I think this is where healing occurs, in this idea of broadening our view and not just narrowing in so potently, but instead broadening, so we can get the whole picture of what is going on with us, right? And when we can get the whole picture and we can consider it wholeheartedly, then we begin to work towards wholeness. Now, what wholeness is not, is it is not trying to manufacture this idea that we're going to get to the top right-hand quadrant and we're going to never again experience the other three quadrants, or almost like fragmenting from those quadrants or separating from those quadrants, right? That's not wholeness. Wholeness is seeing it all, right? And this is where Richard's concept of self comes in. And so this is a really beautiful and enlightening concept. So he talks about how in his decades of work in psychotherapy, he's never met anyone that doesn't have what he calls self, which is this inner core of who you are. So not even a part, this inner core of who you are that's undamaged. It doesn't need to be developed. It doesn't need to transform. It is automatically there when we practice accessing it. And he talks about that there are 8 characteristics of self, and they just all happen to start with C. And those characteristics are compassion, curiosity, clarity, creativity, calm, confidence, courage, and connectedness. So when I think about self and I think about our 4 quadrants of life, I think it would be easy to think like, oh, self is the one who lives in the top right-hand quadrant. You know, that's our free and engaged quadrant. That's the inspired quadrant. That's where we want to be. That's where joyful, healthy living happens, right? But maybe even more to the point, maybe joyful, healthy living actually happens when we are able to hold all 4 quadrants. So think about that for a second. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't think it's self that lives in the top right-hand quadrant. I think it's self who is able to hold and witness all 4 quadrants. And then what Richard talks about in his work is as we are willing to unblend with these burdened parts of ourselves and we're willing to give them space to be seen and heard, they will spontaneously transform and heal. And so a firefighter might become a really, really responsible part of you that wants to help you build structure in your life. And so I almost see the top right-hand quadrant as these healed and reformed parts, right? So the one that used to act like a firefighter, but now is able to act within the top right-hand quadrant. And the one who used to act like a manager, but now is able to act in the top right-hand quadrant. And the one that used to hold the burdens of the exile, but now is one who is able to act in the top right-hand quadrant. And self is that ever-present witnesser, the one that has capacity, the part of us that's not a part that knows how to be kind. We've been conditioned in our culture to believe that willpower is the key to goodness. And I think that's because it does have the power to move us out of the what's wrong with me quadrant, the exile essence, to the manager essence, right? From the bottom left-hand quadrant to the bottom right-hand quadrant. And so it has the power to buffer the exile feelings. But that movement from the bottom left-hand quadrant to the bottom right-hand quadrant isn't true transformation. And it's not true healing, right? And this is what Richard promotes in his work as well, that true healing, true transformation, true positive change never comes from willpower. Because willpower is really just blending with a manager. Willpower can produce behavior change, certainly. But to mindlessly narrow into behavior change is missing huge, huge aspects of what true transformation, true healing, true healthy, joyful living is all about. There's much more going on than just the behavior. And as we talk about in the course, the same behavior can land in any of the 4 quadrants. So we have to look at the intentions of the behavior, and this parallels right along with Richard's work, because he talks about how it's not about changing the behavior, it's about understanding the behavior and realizing that all these parts of us are really just trying to keep ourselves safe. So there are no bad parts. So the key, the absolute key, is not a manipulative overriding effort, which we know as willpower. The key is an unblending and a holding space and a listening. In that energy, true transformation happens. Spontaneous transformation happens. Sustainable transformation happens. We've been sold the lie that willpower and behavior change is the key to what you want. But really, it's gentleness. It's gentleness. It's understanding. Understanding you have no bad parts. You might just sometimes unconsciously blend with parts of you that are misinformed about what true safety is at this point in your life. But at one point, when they internalized a hurt, they really, really helped you. And so there is a beauty in all the aspects of who we are and understanding that, so that we have a much richer understanding of ourselves and then therefore others, because how we relate to these aspects of ourselves, how we relate to our parts, is how we end up relating to other people as well. So there are no bad parts of you. There are only parts that can wreak havoc when we blend with them instead of hold space for them. And that's the power of unblending. And that is the power of Richard Schwartz's work. So I really encourage you to check it out. To do that, you can go to his website, which is www.ifs, as in internal family systems, so ifs-institute.com.